Hello, good day everyone. It is great to be presenting the Systems Thinking Principles and Social Change course to you. My name is Colleen Magner, and this course is for those of you who are working in an increasingly complex and changing environment, working typically with social challenges. And this is a course where we offer alternative ways of understanding how we think and solve problems, and how we navigate a world of interconnectedness and constant change. So this course is for people who work at the cutting edge of social change, for people who need to manage higher levels of complexity and relationships outside of their own domain and control, and for people who are interested in creating a more equitable and sustainable future. As you know, I've done a short clip on myself. I have been with Gibbs a long time, and since leaving Gibbs in 2007 and working with RIOS, my world is very much as a practitioner, which is working with groups who have a shared social challenge and need to work out what to do together. And so it's about collaboration and innovation. And I have found systems thinking to be very helpful as a way of breaking through stuckness or old thinking and to address the challenges at hand in new and innovative ways. So I work for an organization called RIOS Partners, and RIOS is a social enterprise that works around the world. And we work on issues of human rights, education, business, climate change, food security, energy, health, policy reform, and social cohesion. And I'm going to give you a few examples because I think this is helpful context for you to know where I'm coming from in the application of systems change, and how systems thinking is useful to change systems. And we're going to talk about this notion of systems and explain it a little bit further along this lesson. So let me move to the next slide, which is an example that I want to start with. Here you've got a highly pixelated set of photographs of two individuals that were involved in coming together to develop a set of scenarios about the future of Colombia right in the midst of a civil war 25 years ago. So Ada Abella, on the right, was a Communist Party city councillor, and Victor Carranza was a paramilitary warlord, the picture on the left. And they were both invited to participate in looking at what might happen in the future of Colombia. And my colleague Adam Kahane facilitated this set of scenarios, and he tells the story of Ada arriving after Victor had taken his seat and arrived in the first workshop. She walked in and said to the convener, who is a gentleman called Juan Manuel Santos, who went on to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to help broker peace in Colombia over 20 years later, which started in this process. So she'd said to the convener who invited them both, "How do you expect me to sit down with this man who's tried to have me killed 5 times?" And he said to Ada, "It's exactly because we don't want him to try for a 6th time that you need to sit down and participate." And this is quite an important example because collaboration sometimes is essential, even if it is with people who are your enemies. And systems thinking helps us understand when we need to do this. So let me move to the next slide, which is another more recent example of a process we facilitated in RIOS to deal with the energy crisis in Indonesia. And here you've got NGO leaders, academics, and heads of major energy companies coming together and debating, as you can see, and discussing possible futures for energy in Indonesia. The next picture I want to show you is home. And this is a group of people in a workshop that met several times during the course of the year to look at how to solve the problem of land reform in South Africa. And the purpose of this particular workshop was to try to understand how people see the current context of land reform. So this is systems thinking in practice by bringing different people that represent parts of the system together. So around this table you have somebody from the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, which has now changed, but that's what they were called when this workshop was happening. You have somebody who's a large private landowner, you have somebody from a large sugar company, you have someone representing the cooperative movement of farming, and you have an activist academic, all sitting around the table, all deeply invested in land reform, building a model about how they see the current land reform system in South Africa. And the final example I want to show you is a picture of a group of people who were working at how to make the City of London more socially inclusive and addressing the problems of gentrification and how minority groups are pushed out and have less and less access to the city. So these are all examples of what we call shared social issues. And what are the processes that we run to help people address these challenges that are often outside of their control, and how to work together with others in maybe in positions that have different outlooks or might disagree about what to do. So with that background, what are we going to try and do in the lesson and in the overall module of systems thinking and social change? So what we're going to do across the three lessons is try to introduce these concepts of systems thinking, which are vast, and to try to introduce them to you in a way that is relevant to your own context, and to help you apply them to how you would approach innovation, how you would set up a social enterprise or address a new challenge. And what are the steps to take to apply systems thinking and bring different stakeholders together to address a shared challenge. The third objective there is we will be applying design thinking, particular approach to a particular complex problem that you face. And finally, what are ways in which you can work with others that you don't necessarily agree, like, or trust? And we call this stretch collaboration, so we'll be introducing that concept to you too. So let's get going and introduce some concepts of systems thinking. So what we're going to try to do in the next 15 minutes or so is give you a handle on and an understanding of some basic concepts for understanding systems thinking. We've given you some pre-readings, and hopefully that's helped you start to think about it. And secondly, to understand what the difference is between systems thinking and other more conventional ways of thinking. So what's that definition? And then to look at what these concepts actually mean for application tools. What do we actually do with systems thinking? So this is what we will cover in the next lesson. So let me ask you a question. As you listen to this slideshow, I'd like you to just answer for yourself what you understand systems thinking to be. What words come up for you? Take a few seconds to just access what are those concepts or words that come up for you when you think about what systems thinking is. Maybe it is about the relationship between different parts Maybe it is about the combination of things is greater than the parts. These are some of the things we hear about systems thinking. Maybe it is about dynamic systems and their relationships to each other. I'm just getting into your minds here, but just try to access how you would define it. And then I'd like you to do another little thought experiment. When you look at this diagram that comes up here, what do you see? There is a man sitting on a chair. Maybe you see him looking a bit disinterested and pushing a block over to your right, his left. And then that block causes a chain reaction. Let's call it a domino effect. That's what you see. What else do you notice? Do you notice how that domino effect increases the velocity or the speed at which these blocks fall over? And what does that actually mean for him? It looks like he doesn't really realize the implications of his actions, that they're going to come back and knock him down much harder than the force at which he pushed over the first block. So this diagram, which some of you know well, is a really great example of what we are trying to achieve in this course. Systems thinking is about helping this man turn around and understand the knock-on impact of his actions. So he is only in control of the blocks to his left and right. But what happens when he pushes one over? It has an impact on a much wider system. So we're at minimum going to teach you how to see the potential knock-on effects and interactions of a system. And at best, and this is where the agency comes, at best we're going to introduce some tools to help you intervene. Either this man gets off his chair and gets out of the way, or he goes to stop the blocks, or he changes the direction of the blocks. And that's really the visual to demonstrate the objectives of this course. Another useful visual that I'd like to introduce to you, which is also one of these archetypal images, is this representation of the fable of the blind man and the elephant. And to remind you, the fable goes something like this. A king in a village in India called his blind men elders together and asked them to describe what an elephant was. And so the one blind man argued that the elephant was a rope when he touched the tail. And the other blind man said, no, the elephant's a tree trunk as he touched the leg. And the other blind man said, no, this is a pipe as he touched the trunk. And so they debated for weeks about what the elephant was. And then the king said, describe to each other what you feel. And as they started describing what they were touching, they were able to make sense of the elephant. And this is another really great fable to demonstrate the power of systems thinking. When we listen to others and when we really try to understand their place in a system, we start to understand the system as a whole. We cannot understand a system only from our vantage point. So a lot of systems thinking is about inquiry and about understanding others' experience and perspectives of a particular context. So now I'm going to start introducing a few quotes and definitions to help pull this together. And let me start with this famous quote by a conservationist called John Muir, who speaks about the interconnectedness of systems, that actually no system is a standalone thing. All systems are connected to other systems. And he says this by saying, when we try to pick out any one thing by itself, we find it is hitched to just about everything else in the universe. So as soon as we start to try to understand, what's our organization as a system and who do we interact with, then we start to see all of the different organizations and touch points and people that we participate in activity with or serve. And we realize that actually our organization isn't a standalone system. It is connected to just about everything else, just like a family system is. The second definition is a more word. I'm going to just ask you to take a minute to read this quote by Josiah Willard Gibbs, who is a Yale scientist and a systems thinker. He's much more of an expert than I am. So let me just take a moment to give you time to read this quote. So let me break this down for you. Essentially what Gibbs is saying here is that systems are made up. We choose to define a system in order to change it. And in order to change it, we have to understand it. So this is really important in systems thinking. Systems are not fixed. They are made up in order for us to understand and to change them. So a lot of intervening in systems change is to decide what is my system that I want to try and change. And that's not necessarily so straightforward to identify. We'll get to that later when we draw a systems map. So how is systems thinking different from normal thinking? So in conventional thinking, and how we are taught to solve difficult or complex problems in conventional ways, is to look at a problem, to break up components of that problem, to break it up into parts. For example, if you are running an organization, you look at different functions of that organization or departments and get them operating well and fix parts of the organization and then trust that the organization will function well as a whole. So you break down to the minute detail where there might be a problem, fix it, and then put it together, like fixing a car. So that would be using the magnifying glass to really understand what's the micro issue here that we need to fix. Who's the problem person in our team that we need to address? System thinking takes a different approach. It says that actually the behavior of a system is because of its overall purpose and the interaction of the parts of that. So the requirement is to step away, to create some distance, to be able to understand the relationship between the parts of a particular system, which is why there's a pair of binoculars there, that you are stepping back and trying to look at what's outside of your control, what are the touch points, and what is the logic of the system and why it works like it is. So, quickly as a summary of what I've covered, that give you some concepts of what systems thinking is. Systems are subsystems of bigger systems, right? In systems thinking, nothing is separated. The only reason why we separate out a particular system, whether it's a family or an organization or a community or a country, is in order to understand it, in order to influence it. Systems are artificially constructed. We make up boundaries around a system in order to understand and influence. A system isn't a sum of its parts, but a product of the interaction of its parts. So it is how, it's not, a car is not the wheel, it's not the engine. They cannot run on their own. It is the relationship between the wheel and the engine and petrol and all the other components of a car that make it work. The same with a social system. We're now going to move into so I've given you a bit of a definition of systems thinking. Now I have some concepts that are related to systems thinking that I would like us to cover. Okay, so I'm going to introduce 3 concepts to you to provide some useful input to application of systems thinking. And the first concept is the difference between physical and conceptual reality, which we'll get into in a moment. The second is this notion of paradigms, and the third, leverage points. So you might look at this and say, gosh, this is such jargon, but I'm going to break it down for you because these are very important concepts in systems thinking and very useful concepts. So let's start with the difference between physical and conceptual reality. So when you're trying to understand a system, you look at who's involved, what are the different parts of that system, it might be organizations or people, and you observe what you see. And this is the physical reality. What is there? So if a forest is ahead of you, you see trees and you see plants and you see grass and you see birds. That is what is. Conceptual reality is what we think about what is. So it's how you interpret what you see. And this is why that elephant diagram was so important, because everybody sees a particular system completely differently because of how they interpret it and what becomes their conceptual reality. So in understanding systems, it's not just about objectively doing a systems map or a stakeholder analysis. Systems thinking is very much around understanding what people perceive that system looks like and what it does and its purpose and what needs to change. And that is the human side of systems thinking. Next one, the issue of paradigms. So paradigms, let me just again take a moment to have you sort of connect to what your understanding of paradigms is. Paradigms is a difficult concept because it's so hard to understand your own paradigm. A paradigm can be defined as your worldview, how you believe things to be, why you believe things to be as they are. It is a deeply entrenched, often invisible to yourself, way of viewing the world. And the only way you can actually understand your own paradigm, or even a systems paradigm, is when you come into conflict with a different paradigm. You are challenged. And then you realize what is deep-seated and what is a belief that you hold because of your experiences, your upbringing, your values, your conviction, your ideology. All of these things influence what your paradigm is, your worldview. And Donella Meadows, one of the pre-readings that was sent to you, she is one of the leading systems thinkers. She's passed away now. And she writes about your paradigm is so intrinsic to your mental process that you are hardly aware that it exists. And that really the only way you understand it is when you try to communicate with someone with a different paradigm. So the final concept is that of leverage that I want to cover with you. And all systems change happens by understanding leverage. And leverage is that place, or those places in a particular system, that a relatively small change has a much bigger impact. And we talk about positive and negative feedback loops as well, which if we go back to the domino diagram, the leverage there is the man pushing over the domino, and that leverage of pushing over had a much stronger effect on the impact of the final outcome than him pushing it over. And leverage comes from the concept of lever, and as you can see, this arm is pushing down a lever, the strength of an arm, but being able to pick up a weight much heavier that an arm or set of arms can pick up together. So it's a place in a system where a small change could lead to a large shift in the behavior of that system. And the big challenge is you don't understand necessarily where the leverage is until you start to understand the system more deeply and how it works. So we get to the final part of this lesson, which is about helping you start to understand your system. So I have an individual exercise for you, but let me explain what a systems map is first. You are going to be drawing your own systems map, but let me explain what one is. So a systems map is a picture, it's a diagram, and it's a representative diagram of a particular context. And you represent that, you represent your world, your surroundings through symbols and flows that show what's currently going on in the system. And the reason why we draw a picture of our system, and we draw all the different people in our system, and we draw little blobs or circles or squares, and we draw lines between them to show the relationship, and we draw a boundary around them. The reason why we do that is to understand what is the system we're trying to influence, to set focus for our work, and to articulate the pieces of that larger effort. Break it down into parts to understand what are those parts, and to invite a diversity of perspective without requiring agreement. Each part of the system has a different view. So here are some guidelines for your task. Think about a system you want to influence or change in your industry or sector. Okay? Locate yourself in that system. Where are you now? Can you actually name what your system of exploration is? Maybe it's a community. Maybe it is a group of people with the same interest. Maybe it's a club. Maybe it's an organization. Maybe it's a department. Maybe it's a family. Can you draw a boundary around that system? In other words, what is outside of your system of exploration and what is inside of it? And then try to think of all the players of people or organizations, in other words, groups of people that you need to interact with in this particular system. Make sure that you are in there too. Try to understand what's the distance between these different people. You can draw lines and arrows. And there is a whiteboard exercise by my colleague Andrew that gives you an example of a systems map that I'd like you to watch first before you have a go yourself. And it really is about drawing dots, blobs, arrows, and being creative about drawing the systems map as. So please check out the whiteboard clip of how to draw a systems map. And the instructions